Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DESARA Group and NQA's latest webinar, Cybersecurity and ISO 27001, Implementing a Secure Information Security Management System. My name is Karen Rawson, and I'll be joined today by Tim Woodcomb from NQA. Unfortunately, Dave Santacola is not with us today, but the DESARA Group, before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about us. We're a company that prepares companies for certification rather than does the certification audit itself. So we would be the consultant that would work with you throughout the year and a half, 2 years it might take to implement a management system standard such as ISO 27001. We do ISO 9001 and TL 9000 others, and we have a very experienced team. We don't bring in the recent MBAs and move them into consulting roles. We're people who have actually been in the trenches before. We specialize on the ICT industry. We can offer, in addition to this, we can do audits of various kinds on the internal side. So we can audit your suppliers, you can outsource internal audits to us, we can help you get started, go in after the fact when there's been a problem, and we offer training services. And now I'll turn it over to Tim Woodcomb to introduce himself at NQA.
Sure, thanks, Karen. So I work with NQA, who is a certification body. So we are the firm or type of firm that you would engage after working with someone like Karen and DESARA. Once you're established and implemented a ISMS and are ready to have that audited and certified. So NQA is a certification body or a registrar, other terms that are kind of interchangeably used. NQA is a global certification body, so I am based out of the US, but we do have auditors and offices around the globe. And we've been doing this for over 30 years now. Of course, that would have started primarily with ISO 9001 back in the day, but we now offer upwards of 20 different ISO and derivative certifications. Client base-wise, we're over 40,000 clients globally, and of course focused on a lot of the up-and-coming standards such as ISO 27001 on the information security, but also related to that ISO 20000-1 for IT service management and ISO 22301 business continuity. And all of those standards fall under my responsibility, if you will, as a business unit director within the organization.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Now, there's no relationship between NQA and the DESARA Group other than partnering together on webinars and things like that. We have sent, some of our clients have selected, many of our clients have selected NQA as their CB, but it's not a hand-in-hand type relationship by any means. And NQA may refer leads to consultants, but by no means specializes in any one. That's important to keep that independence between the two organizations, but I'll tell you this, we wouldn't be partnering on a webinar with somebody whose audits we didn't respect. So NQA is one of the top registrars in the certification bodies in the world, in the country, and definitely in DESARA's opinion based on the feedback from our customers. So thanks, Tim. Tim will be joining us later to talk about the certification process itself, and also when we go through the controls, the part of the webinar. Okay, so here in this webinar on implementing a secure ISMS, we'll be going through cybersecurity versus information security. We'll talk about risks and why it's important to have an ISMS, how different companies approach information security, and then we'll get into an overview of what's required in ISO 27001, including the controls, which we'll go through very quickly because there's 114 of them, so we're just going to give you a flavor for them, and how to implement and how to get certified. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, but at this point, I'll just turn off my camera so we can focus on the presentation, and we'll move on. Okay, you're in the right place if you're on this call. If you're an IT leader, if you are, you probably already know where the risks are, but you also know that you can't do it alone. IT leaders know that they need the full organization at all levels to have an effective information security. Many members of the technical staff may need to make changes to the work they do to meet requirements of NIST or ISO 27001 or other standards. And so if you're being asked to make changes to implement any overall governance, then you need to see the big picture, and this webinar will give you that information. I know we tend to skew towards quality between NQA and DESARA, but we probably have some quality professionals on the line, and you'll find that your experience with management systems like ISO 9001 can definitely be leveraged to help develop the ISMS. You may play a leadership role. Sales professionals may be the ones who are bringing an ISMS into the business because they find that their customers want security in their contracts. So you'll see through this webinar what it'll take to satisfy those needs. And then I just wanted to talk a little, oh, by the way, before I go any further, I just wanted to mention that on the handout section of this webinar panel, you know, where you have your controls, where you can raise your hand and so forth, there is a box for handouts, 3 of 5. Now that's where you can download the workbook for today. And the workbook for today will give you a place to take notes on this, because chances are you won't go back and print out the whole presentation, but you can download from the handouts tab the workbook itself to take notes, and also you can download the PDF of this presentation. Now tomorrow you'll get a recording of the presentation as well as access to the PDF online. You'll get another mailer that'll have that. But if you want to take notes as you go along, go ahead and download the Cybersecurity and ISO 27001 workbook. It's about 8 pages, I guess, that you can take your notes on. So let's get into what is information security and why is it important? Well, first of all, imagine if confidential business information or personal private information got out of your company where it shouldn't be. You'd have a risk to confidentiality. Or if you had, if you went in to use a file and it says there was an error opening this file, it's corrupt and cannot be opened. Well, you can't get into the data you need. Or if you suspect that the data you've got is somehow missing, or someone's been in there that shouldn't be in there and messed something up, that's a loss of integrity of the data. And then you could say physical disaster or pandemic. Your information needs to be available to you if you're working from home, if you've got a skeleton staff out there, if you've got, if the power's out, and how do people actually get to that data. So information security is about not just the hackers that we're afraid of getting into our products, who would actually attack confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but actually any kind of threat to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are the big 3 to keep in mind. So I'd ask you, how has your company considered risks to your information and to the systems that process it? Well, companies with an ISMS face risks in a particular systematic way. It all starts with management planning and oversight. That is, this is a conscious decision by management on how good is good enough in terms of protection of our information, and how will we know how we're doing against those goals. So management establishes goals and measurements for the information security management system. The second thing that companies with an ISMS do to face the risks is they analyze and systematically treat those risks. That is, they catalog what could go wrong, and they say, what can we do to stop it from happening, and put those stops in place, or what am I going to do if it does happen? What's my next step? That's the next thing, the systematic investigation and correction of security incidents. Much like a corrective action process in quality, where you get to the root of the problem and you make sure it doesn't happen again, this would be like the one that got away and actually got to the marketplace of some sort of incident that was a threat to your information. You would want to investigate it and close it out so it doesn't happen again. We'll talk more about that when we get into the controls. ISO 27001 and companies with an ISMS also have a change management process. And that's because whenever we undergo change as an organization or to a product or to our processes, that's where the leaks often happen. So it's important when you're changing anything with your hardware, your software, your ways of working, that you systematically make the changes and consider the risks associated with those changes or resulting from them. Next, they have an objective evaluation of methods and their effectiveness. So that would be an internal audit program followed by a third-party certification, as well as evaluating the metrics that management has set. The important thing to remember about companies with an information security management system is that it's about managing and it's a system. It's a company-wide approach. It's not something that IT can do just by clicking a few buttons. And we'll talk as we go on about what are those things that that they're required of people who work in under a management system. Now, I've been saying information security. We also hear a lot about cybersecurity. The important thing to realize is that people often use these terms interchangeably. The ISO people use information security rather than cybersecurity in most cases. And in general, it's seen that information security is all information, whether it's online or not, or on a computer or not, bits and bytes. And cybersecurity would include those things that are stored electronically. And there is some overlap. Don't get hung up on the differences. Just find what your company is going to use. And for now, they're pretty much used interchangeably. Now, what would happen if you don't have an information security management system? Well, you could have risks to your own business in terms of reputation, lost sales, which may carry on long term, and the cost to clean up your mess. But your customers also have a risk of your information security leak, such as they don't get their orders and there's a downstream impact on them and their customers. Their information may be exposed, which could have long-term impact on them, and they may have a cost to clean up the mess. And then, of course, there's a public risk. Kind of like a pandemic. If the really bad stuff gets out there, there's a propagation of the problem. But there's also just every time there's a problem with security someplace, it causes the public to have greater distrust in systems. And if there's too much of a distrust in systems, there will be regulations if those voluntary controls don't work. So here's some of the controls that have been the approaches that have been used to address cybersecurity. First of all, customers have put requirements for security in their contracts. And of course, businesses have always had methods and procedures and even policies to control the leak of information from their businesses. I mean, obviously, you lock the door behind you. You have locked file cabinets, protected passwords for your data online, and so forth. And then there are also regulatory standards that often companies don't like having things regulated because there are so many cases that make it difficult to comply with, and it might be overkill, like the Healthcare Act or the Sarbanes-Oxley or the European requirement for privacy of information, why we all have to accept cookies on everything we do now. So what we're talking about is ISO 27001, which is a voluntary standard used throughout the world, quickly becoming the standard of choice because it is international. Here's a picture of the cover of it. And the title is Information Technology. That's the group that wrote it. Security Techniques, Information Security Management System. So that's kind of like drilling down through ISO's layers of documentation. And then it says requirements. So this is the only standard in the ISO 27001 suite to which you would actually get certified. There are 27,000 family of standards. The 27,000 is a glossary overall. And then they have guidance and best practices for things like private information or telecom or working in the cloud. And you can't get certified to those. Those CBs are able to write a letter of attestation or a non-accredited certificate showing that you comply with the guidance that's in those documents. But the 27001 requirements is designed to preserve, as I was harping on before, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. It takes a risk management approach. Those are the real differences. Those two are big differences with ISO 9001. And the point is that if you have a certificate, then your interested parties, such as your shareholders, your customers, even your suppliers that you partner with in some cases, and the public, your users, can have confidence that you've got a management system in place that you're monitoring. This is the only one you get certified to. So I'll tell you about the front part of the standard now, the clauses of the standard. We're going to get into the appendix and take the bulk of the presentation for that. Well, ISO 27001 is designed on a plan, do, check, act cycle just like ISO 9001 and TL 9000 and ISO 14001 and many other standards. It asks you to establish the management system to begin with. What's going to be covered by it? And you can't just say, well, you can, but you're strongly urged not to, and you have to work with your CB to make a case for it. You're strongly urged not to just have it be your IT department within scope, but to rather have it be the broader organization, some chunk of the organization you can pull off. You establish your objectives and the major policies within the context of the organization, like where you operate and who you serve and what issues you face. Then you implement processes, controls, and resources. You maintain the system by operating accordingly in a systematic and consistent way. And then you look at the data from your system, or look at your internal audits or your customer feedback, your incident management, so that you can continually improve the processes and improve your security. As I said, it's an organization-wide approach. It's not just about the hardware and software. So here's a more familiar chart that you may recognize if you're involved with quality at all. The way the standard is organized is you define the context of your organization. What's the water we swim in? What's this big blue box? Who are we trying to serve and how? And what are the issues that we face with respect to security? Like, are we in a regulated environment and so forth? You establish the leadership, which says that management is going to decide on the policies. It's going to decide on the objectives. How good do we really need to be? What are the things that we're protecting against? I have a client, for example, who was not particularly worried about protecting the information in their product. They do training products, and they weren't particularly interested in online training. They weren't particularly interested in tracking anybody stealing the content, because once anybody buys the training product, it's not a big reach to go learn the stuff and train somebody else on it. But rather, they were worried about the secret sauce of how the database worked on the back end, and how the private information of the people who were accessing the tests. So anyway, the leadership establishes how good do we need to be, and a support system needs to evolve to do the things like audits and document management and managing competence and managing making sure there's a legal structure for the business to operate under and so forth. And then the cycle goes, as I said on the last one, planning for the business, for the information security management system, working it according to the processes and principles and practices that have been defined in order to protect from risks. Operation means doing annual risk assessment and risk treatment plans. And then performance evaluation, looking at, are we getting better? Have we suffered any attacks? And then improving based on that information. Okay, so you see from operation, there's an arrow here going from Annex A controls. Well, ISO 27001 is built on 10 clauses 4 through 10, containing all of this stuff. And operation in clause 8, it says you have to analyze your risks and work to treat them. Annex A says these are the methods that you'll use, 114 different controls, and you can use more if they apply. You may say we've got GDPR requirements or NIST requirements that we also want to apply. You operate according to those controls that you put in place to protect your information. So if you're already familiar with 9001, some of these clauses will look familiar. These are the clauses and the requirements of ISO 27001, like having objectives and having internal audit and having management review how we're performing against those. The parts that are underlined, information security risk assessment and risk treatment, are different from what you've seen on the quality side. On the quality side, it says you shall use risk-based thinking. It doesn't exactly put it in those words, but the point is consider the risks. This standard, 27001, says define the risks and consciously act to reduce them to a threshold that you're willing to live with. So let's talk about what those 114 controls you would use to protect your information assets. I call it the wall between your information and the outside world that might want to access it. And these are like bricks in the wall, your policies, how you're organized to treat information security, and so on. As these pop up here, you'll say, oh yeah, we've got that. We've got some of those things. But we'll show you in the next 14 slides, we'll show you these controls, how they're broken down into different groups. So each one of these has 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more controls underneath them to add up to the 114. And compliance, of course. So I'm going to bring Tim Wickham back in a minute. We're going to go bounce back and forth on these controls and tell you what is in the standard. What does the standard roughly say about what you have to do or demonstrate that you do to protect your information? One of the ways you protect information is that management shall establish a set of policies to direct and support information security. They're to take into account and know you have a registry of what are the relevant laws and regulations, and what is the business need as well as what does the customer require of you. Meaning when you go in to do an audit or when your CB comes in, they should be looking at what are the customers require. Do they require you to comply with certain standards or promote certain information, report certain information, or protect certain information in a certain way? And now I'll hand it over to Tim. We'll just bounce back and forth on these domains. Now you've got a place for these on your on the last page of your next to the last page of your workbook if you want to take notes. But remember, you will get a copy of this tomorrow, or you can download it right now from the handouts section. So Tim, you want to talk about domain 6?
Sure, thanks, Karen. So domain 6, like 5, kind of a higher level set of controls, if you will. These will get deeper into the technical space as we go along pretty quickly here, but domain 6 talks about organization of information security, so kind of more of a planning or structural thing from the organization's perspective. Talks about various roles and responsibilities within the information security system, the duties of those folks, and most importantly, making sure that there is some segregation of duties to prevent unauthorized uses or accesses. Also relates to communications or interactions with various authorities or special interest groups, and recognizes that project management might be a consideration as well, where information security needs to be thought of in a slightly different manner. So those kind of sum up some of the organizational perspectives on how the information security program should be structured.
One of the things you'll find in some of these controls is that they mirror requirements that you would see elsewhere in the standard. So the point is that even though the standard says you have to manage competence, you have to assign responsibilities so that people have competence to do them, there will be, I need to flip the slide here. Domain 7 talks about a lot more than what you'd find just in the basic clauses about human resources. For example, if you're going to trust your information to your employees, who are often the biggest source of information security leaks, either maliciously or just inadvertently, phishing attacks and things like that, you need to be sure that these people aren't coming in with malicious intent. So HR would be responsible for screening and setting up terms and conditions of employment, getting that attestation that everyone will follow the policies and procedures. And then we put it under, the authors of ISO 27001, put it under human resources security, the point that when people leave, how do you get back the information or information processing devices that they were dealing with? So those would be all under domain 7. Tim?
All right, and then domain 8 starts to talk about some of the more technical areas. So it talks about asset management. And assets, primarily most people will think of the hardware and software type assets, but it also starts to get in some of the informational assets, if you will. So within this control family, it talks both about those hardware, software type assets and keeping inventory and understanding who owns those and the acceptable use of those assets, along with, as Karen mentioned, on the return side, if folks are leaving the organization or for any other reason need to return assets, how all that is tracked in a more physical sense. But then with regards to information, the standard looks for the organization to classify information basically as to its level of security or information sensitivity, if you will. And that is done both by classifying and then thereby labeling it. And that then starts to flow down to how you would handle that type of information asset. And then that goes on into the final area in section 8, which is the handling of media. So media being not the media on TV, but be it removable media like USB drives or portable hard drives, disks if those are still being used, that type of media, if you will. So the management of that type of information on a movable or portable device, again, at its end of life or when it needs to be disposed of, how that's done so, again, with security concerns in mind. So all those 3 areas focus on the management of assets relative to information.
And Domain 8 ties closely with Clause 8 of the standard that says you got to do a risk assessment of what you've got and handle it accordingly. So this is the numbers don't necessarily line up on all of these, but I just want to make the point that the idea of understanding what your assets are and doing something about them is listed in 2 places. And the standard and the controls can get a little tricky sometimes. It takes more than a 1-hour class to understand what's in there, and really takes team working together to understand these and apply the requirements. Domain 9 is about access control. What we want to do is the principle of people who need information have access to it. People who don't need information don't have access to it. So if you've got a company-wide shared directory that everyone can get in and out of, all different customers, all different projects, that might not support your need for controlling access to information. So you may have multiple passwords, and what system administrators can do and what individual end users can do, and you've got to set up the control. One of the ways that you control risks to your assets is by making sure that no one who shouldn't be messing with them is messing. Tim?
Okay, domain 10 is cryptography. Very short set of controls. There's only 2 controls in it. I could probably read them verbatim for you in the time we have allotted, but suffice to say, folks that might not be in the IT area, cryptography might sound a little bit daunting, a little bit space age. So this is where the controls do start to get much, much heavier into the IT space. And I would assume that most IT folks are familiar with cryptography, if not comfortable with it. And suffice to say that there are relatively straightforward methods out there to get encryption. Usually it's by some kind of layer or software or other control that you would more or less purchase and employ within your system. But this would allow allow your data or email or whatever it might be to be encrypted, so that even if it were intercepted, if you will, it would be rendered really unusable or unreadable by whomever got it that wasn't supposed to get it. So the controls are very short and sweet, as I mentioned, about having an encryption or a cryptography policy. Of course, there may be various things within that, but then one of the key things would be exactly that, management of the encryption keys, so that data that's coming in or out can be decrypted by the right people at the right time through that key management process.
Thanks, Tim. One of the next set of requirements under controls is in Domain 11, physical and environmental security. Now, this is exactly why we say that you can't just stop information security at the IT department. Imagine if people left facilities open where people could get in and out. In many companies, you've even got departments that are walled off, and you can't go in there without having the proper badge or proper clearance. So physical and environmental security is designed to make sure that information and equipment, the information that's, equipment and the information it contains is not lost, damaged, stolen, or compromised. And that would go for the buildings as well as the cabling outside the building, so somebody can't tap into your lines and so forth.
Okay, operations security. This is probably one of the heaviest areas in terms of the number of controls within it, and very IT centric as well. So operations security really focuses on a lot of the day-to-day IT operations that are probably already going on within many organizations. It does start off with kind of a high level, having a documented procedure or policy as far as operational activities within the IT space. That would cover things like change management. So if and when there's changes going on within the IT hardware, software, again, making sure that information security is maintained throughout that change process. Understanding capacity management so that, again, you're not left with a security concern if you reach a capacity constraint. Separation of development and testing, and that will come back into play later when we talk about development in a little more depth, but kind of sets the stage for IT having provisions for a separate test bed or test environment, if you will, for things that may be applicable there. Again, with the thought that you're not intermingling or mixing security concerns for something that you're just developing. It goes on into, again, probably some things that are more or less in place, making sure that there's malware concerns enacted, that there's a backup process and hardware and software for that. Logging and monitoring of events and down through what we'll get into as incidents. So again, in most cases, that's probably already going on. Controlling that operational software, again, with thoughts, in this case, again, more towards informational security of that. Monitoring technical vulnerabilities within the IT system. And then finally, making sure that any audits or any reviews or any oversight that's going on as part of this is done not to have any disruptions or cause any disruptions, but rather to minimize any of the business as usual activities.
Okay. Domain 13 is communication security, and it refers to how the network is set up so that it's secure, because you'll be transferring information both within and outside the company. So this all refers to IT stuff again. The system administrators will need to go through these controls in detail and say, how are we actually set up, and what are the risks to our information through the network, and are we set up to make sure that our information is secure? This is the kind of thing that we're really glad everyone has done, assuming they've done it, when we get into this massive work from home situation. We don't want things, people getting into stuff that that the competitors and customers could get into where they're not supposed to get. So Domain 13 would have you have all that stuff set up before you need to use it.
Okay, and domain 14 kind of ties back to a little bit of 12, where we talked about having a separate development and test environment that the IT operations group would set up, because this is talking about both development and maintenance within an organization, assuming that applies, along with acquisition of information systems. So quick tangent on that. Some of these controls may not apply. So just like with requirements within the ISO standards that could be deemed not applicable, as we call it now, controls are likewise subject to that same thing. And really kind of the same methodology or philosophy, that if it truly does not exist, then you can certainly take an exception to it. But if it does exist, then you would need to at least consider, if not apply, that control. So development clearly would be one of those potential exclusions or items that's not applicable. But even if it's not, Section 14 or Control 14, the family, does first start to talk about considering information security with any acquisition of information systems. So even if you're not in a development arena, 14.1 and the controls within that would most likely apply. Thinking about information security as you develop and kind of set up your information systems, along with any public networks that might be used as part of that, and the transactions that are accomplished. but sections 14 or control families 14.2 and 14.3 for that matter are more focused on the design and test activities that may or may not occur within an organization. So you'll kind of know that when you see it, so to speak, if that applies. But suffice to say, if it does apply, a fair number of controls or considerations that need to be given to the development and making sure that security is thought of throughout the development life cycle, all the way again through the testing thereof.
So that's really important if you've outsourced your IT services to someone else, like you don't run your own email server, you use Office 365. You've got to demonstrate that your suppliers are managing your information effectively. You have suppliers who can get into your, maybe they're doing remote work on your equipment, maybe they're have other ways to get into your system, or you're sharing information with suppliers to partner on a job. Under supplier relationships, you've got to establish the controls with your suppliers to make sure that all of your information is protected.
All right, and 16 is information security incident management. So again, most organizations will have some degree of incident management already going on, I would suspect. So this would outline 7 particular controls that, again, may or may not already be in place, starting at kind of having high-level procedures, the types of information that would be recorded during a security event, then getting a little bit deeper into areas that might not exist, like collecting information on security weaknesses, obviously with the thought of shoring up those weaknesses under the guise of continual improvement, if you will. Responding to any information security incidents, and again, using kind of an ISO methodology, having lessons learned from any security incidents. So again, looking for continual improvements out of any of those activities.
Okay. Domain 17 is particularly apropos to these days, information security aspects of business continuity management. Now, the standard seems to assume that you've got a business continuity management plan in place. It doesn't give you all the requirements for that. Tim, what is the standard over business continuity?
ISO 22301.
22301. Okay, that's business continuity can be for any type of organization, but if you've got information that you have to control the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of, you want to be sure that even under conditions such as a pandemic or a physical disaster, you aren't leaking information. You haven't just thrown open the doors wide and let everybody get into your systems. So you have to identify the requirements and plan and implement for the practices for the continuity of information security. And then you have to test it, make sure those plans will actually work. This often involves having redundant systems so that there's enough availability. We're already seeing how quickly Zoom managed to spin up and have everybody online all at once. It's amazing how quickly they were able to do that. Well, they must have had a plan in place for availability of information and sudden demand. Same kind of thing here.
Okay, and then the final family of controls is 18, which deals with compliance. So obviously, as the name kind of implies, we're talking about legal compliance or perhaps contractual requirements. So this is an area that may have some IT involvement, but it may also then start to morph back into other areas of the organization, be it legal or top management or otherwise. But the controls here also kind of get back to that risk assessment that Karen was mentioning, as do all of these technically, but in particular, as you're going through your risk assessment, obviously you'd want to be aware of any legal requirements and contractual requirements. Those are some of the controls in here. Also with regards to intellectual property rights, so that could be either within your organization, IP that you're trying to protect, or outside of it. And again, requirements to protect IP that might not be yours. protection of records thereof, cryptographic regulations, so back to the cryptography control, and then kind of finishing up with any information security reviews, a couple of controls there, a few controls there describing some activities that would define how those controls are to be done, compliance with various security policies, and kind of the technical oversight thereof.
You know, those legal requirements are not for the faint of heart. I just got a multi-page document for a company just for all the different states. I mean, this was a client we were working on something together, and just all the different legal requirements for all the different states where they do business that had information security impacting requirements. So this is not a one-man thing. Sometimes it's outsourced to somebody to identify what those legal requirements are, and you've got contract people inside looking at contract requirements. But so some of these things may already be in the works in your company, but you've got to verify that you meet the requirements of the control. We apply controls to protect against known vulnerabilities. So there can be a threat to a certain type of asset or something inherent in the asset itself that we know, uh-oh, that's a risk. You look at what are the risks, and then how can we have extra confidence that nobody's going to get in there who shouldn't. Obviously, we've got the handshake with our employees, or excuse me, elbow bump with our employees that says, we promise to do what's necessary to stay out of information we're not supposed to get into. But these controls systematize everything, so make it so that you can't go where you're not supposed to go, either very tight controls with encryption and so forth, or the socialization of things like wearing your badges and only going in the parts of the building that you are given access to. The whole point of controls is to make sure that people can't get access to protected information so that you can ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The overall point of these 114 controls is they're the bricks in the wall that is built around the information that you don't want to leak out. So that's the end of the section about what does the standard actually say you have to do. We offer a 2-day training. Actually, we tend to do it in 5 or 8-day implementation workshops that cover planning, implementation, and certification. But we can also do just a 2-day classroom training learning. All this can be offered virtually as well, where we go through what does the standard say. Take that hour, the 45 minutes we've just gone through, and expand that so that you really understand all the parts. But if we're working on an implementation project with you with a high impact launch session, that's the planning part. I'll tell you how each of these phases works. In planning, you've got to have a core team and executive sponsor, somebody on the management team who said, we're going to spend money on this, we're going to assign people to it, and these are going to be our objectives for having information security. We go through training the people who are most likely to be working on developing the controls and performing the risk assessments. And we establish the scope and statement of applicability. Which ones of these controls apply given the risks that our business faces? Like Tim said, you might say, we don't do development. That's one we can check off the box right now and not have to do. In the planning phase, you'd also plan for this project because there are going to be changes made and they'll have impacts on security and possibly quality and possibly scheduling and who knows what. So you really have to have a plan that meets with the rest of the business. And then management would lay out, here's what we're going to do by when and who's going to work on it. The next phase of implementation is the solid implementation after you have the planning done. This is where you write all that documentation about your basic document, record control and internal audit procedure, corrective action procedure, your context of your organization, and statement of your interested parties. You would set up your procedures for performing risk assessment and risk treatment. And you'd set up all those 114 controls we went through. You'd spell out, what does this mean for our business? We just gave you the headlines of what's required, and then you put the how-to into controls or procedures associated with those. And you get people to begin acting upon those what you've decided, those decisions that you've made for protection. The implementation phase is where you actually do the risk assessment and mitigation that you planned for in the previous phase. As I said, this isn't just an IT exercise. You've really got to socialize all these controls that are by position. Socialize the applicable controls to each group. For example, I'll bet in your companies you've already had education for things like anti-phishing. You know, don't just open a link, check it out first, or send it to IT if you have a problem you're not sure if it's something you're supposed to open. Also, during the implementation phase, you train the organization and socialize incident management. So when something looks like it's a near miss, or when something actually happens with a breach of information, theft of a laptop, phone left unlocked and picked up and somebody got into it, somebody in the building who shouldn't have been there, the attacks on your servers and so forth, that you've got somebody monitoring and responding to those incidents in a systematic way. DESARA typically recommends that you choose a chunk of the organization that you can complete 12 to 15 months from the start. Now, if you're just one solo organization with nobody, you know, you're not a division of something, you're not one office with multiple sites, closer to the 12-month mark might be possible. Big multinational organizations may take more than the 15 months, may go into the 2-year range. And the problem is when you start getting beyond about 12 to 15 months, people begin to change in their roles, contracts change, objectives change. So it's nice to get a chunk that you can get done and then use as a pattern for managing changes to your business as you go forward. But anywhere in that 1 to 2 year range, and sometimes a little bit less if you're following a pattern, can work. The last phase of implementation, after you've demonstrated that you're able to do all the things that you set out to do, is you do your internal audits. What we do with our clients is we do one round of internal audits when they think they're about 80% of the way done. They've got the controls written, and as far as they know deployed, they may not have collected a lot of data showing that they've done all the things they're going to do, but you can talk with people and they'll say, this is what we do. This is what we would do if we came up against such and such a case. We find all the non-conformances then that we possibly can. And then the next couple of months, they have to iron out all the wrinkles. Then we do one more full round of internal audits, roughly 4 weeks before the certification body comes in. That's where we have the handoff. DESARA's gone, and well, not gone, we're in the background, but we're not answering any of the questions. But at that point, you would work with the certification body, such as NQA. So Tim, I'll leave it to you to talk about the certification body part from here on.
Sure. Yeah, and I want to echo a lot of what Karen said there. In the early days, probably not so much when 27,000 was a little bit newer. We had many organizations that would call up and kind of think that they could get certified from zero to being certified within a month or two. So certainly the timeline that's put forth here is an adequate one. So if we can go to the next slide, the certification process through NQA, or really through any certification body, first of all, it's overseen, if you will, by oversight organizations, accreditation bodies. So there are rules that we all follow. So a lot of this should be very similar. There are 2 required phases, stage 1 and stage 2, and then an optional gap assessment that NQA would offer. Similar to what DESARA would be doing as far as an internal audit, the difference, I guess, would be that you would have the actual external auditor doing it. That would be the same auditor that would be coming in for the stage 1 and stage 2, so it helps alleviate some of the nervousness, if you will, of that outside body. But the stage 1, as the required first activity, really is focused on confirming that the organization is indeed ready, that they've set up their ISMS appropriately, addressed all the requirements in the standard, addressed the proper controls within their statement of applicability, which we haven't really discussed, but that would kind of be the defining set of controls as selected. And stage 1, the outcome of that, if you will, kind of confirms that things are good to go and establishes the plan for the stage 2 audit. The stage 2 audit is more the hands-on, much longer in duration. Stage 1 is often a day or maybe 2, whereas the stage 2 would be multiple days depending on the size of the organization. And that's really where the rubber hits the road, where all those requirements, all those controls are going to be audited, both in terms of understanding what the policies are, what the procedures are, but also then looking for evidence or records thereof. And as Karen mentioned, not just within the IT group, but then also taking samples across the organization. So a lot of these controls are going to be applied or implemented by people at all levels of the organization, whether it's access control or clean screen, clean desk type issues. We obviously talked about some of the HR controls. So the stage 2 audit would go into all those areas, all those nooks and crannies, to the degree appropriate, of course. I'm not going to pretend that most of the audit isn't spent with IT. A lot of the audit is spent with IT, understanding the information system and controls that are there, but stage 2 goes farther and wider than that to ensure that all those controls that have been established by IT and beyond are flowed down and are being followed throughout the organization. The outcome of the stage 2 would be obviously the recommendation, potentially with some corrective actions that need to be done. And actually, if you want to go to that next slide, that's fine, because that gives you some timelines to consider. So in terms of just kind of walking through those 3 potential activities, the gap assessment, completely optional. You'd want to do that prior to the stage 2, obviously. A lot of organizations choose to do it in conjunction with the stage 1, particularly, I'll say back when we're doing a lot of this on-site, it would make sense to maximize the auditor's time, because the stage 1 typically is on-site. I will admit right now we're allowed kind of special dispensation to do a fair number of these activities off-site. So if you are considering doing any certification in the near future, you certainly, number 1, would want to talk to your certification body about the allowances for off-site activity. But back in a business as usual world, most of these things are done on site. The stage 1 should be considered probably at least a month or so prior to the stage 2. And then the stage 2 itself, as Karen kind of alluded to, you'd want to have at least several months of implementation so that you get enough evidence and get enough comfort probably too with some of the requirements that are there. The next slide, I think, talks a little bit about just clarifying some last thoughts there. So 27001 audits, they're not going to be a full 100% inspection. Really, the goal of the certification body is to confirm that that system is in place, and we can do that through a means of sampling. So we may not look at every record you've got or talk to every person within the organization. We will cover all the controls and all the requirements, but sampling within there. They're also not meant to be subjective, so we hate to hear organizations say that the auditor wanted us to do this. It really should be objective, again, based on what the control from the ISO standard is or the requirement from the ISO standard is, thereby perhaps expounded upon by the organizational procedures, but that should really be where any observations or non-conformances are tied to that objective requirement and either the evidence or lack of evidence to support it. As we've harped on, I think enough, it's not only about IT. Certainly IT has a large role within this, but it needs that holistic organizational approach, because ultimately it's going to be people throughout the organization that, number 1, encourage it and support it and fund it to be stood up, but also then the ones that are following the rules and policies and procedures set out. And then last, but certainly not least, audits, at least from NQA, never are one-way streets. It's not us coming in to dictate what's right, what's wrong, or the way, again, that we think it should be. But an ISO audit really should be a two-way dialogue, especially if you're working with a consultant like DESARA that's set up a strong and stable and robust system. You as the organization should definitely feel empowered to talk about what you've done, what you've implemented, the controls that are there, and how you see those addressing the requirements or controls within ISO. So that kind of gets a two-way dialogue going and gives the auditor a much better feel that that system has been implemented and that you've taken some ownership of it. So make sure you've got that dialogue. The certification process itself is not a once and done. It's basically a 3-year certification. So once you get that initial stage 2 completed, the certificate that you would get would have a 3-year valid period or expiration date, but that's incumbent on maintaining subsequent audits, which if you move the animation forward here would show basically the year after certification would be a surveillance audit, and that would be replicated in year 2. Surveillances are shorter duration audits, kind of as the name implies, just confirming that the system is being maintained. They're shorter in duration, as I mentioned, and therefore would also then have a subset of the controls and requirements being reviewed. Whereas in the 3rd year, it comes back around to what's called a recertification audit, which is more akin to that stage 2 audit, where again, all the controls, all the requirements are reviewed. Assuming you're successful with that, you get another 3-year certification and the cycle just continues on. So just a quick bit more about NQA before we wrap up. One of the things you do want to make sure that your certification body is accredited. I alluded to that. NQA is accredited by ANAB, the US accreditation body. And that simply means that, again, we are following rules. We're following rules that not only we set out for ourselves, but that ANAB sets out and audits us to, and that works all the way up to the international level with ISO and IAF rules that are being followed. NQA ourselves, we've been doing this, as I mentioned, for 30+ years, so it's always good to look for someone with a long-standing track record in whatever your service pursuing there. As I mentioned at the outset, we've got global reach, but obviously a lot of our auditors come from the local area. So if you're listening to us in the US, we'd be working with approximately 20 US-based auditors. And that kind of goes back on down to the way we manage our program. Some organizations have outsourced various parts of the certification processes. We, especially for information security, keep that all domestically based. That's just a choice we've made and resources that we've put towards this. But anyone from the quoting up through the customer service team to the back office team doing the technical reviews, all that information is handled in the US. And then similarly, if you're working outside the US, again, NQA has other operations in other countries.
Before I speak a little bit about the DESARA group, I just want to say that what I appreciate about NQA and what I've seen our customers, our clients, our mutual clients appreciate is that level of local support. The office is very good working with them, but also their stable of auditors. When he said strong stable of auditors, these are people who have many years of experience, and your audit is only as good as your auditor, really. If you find that you have a problem with any certification body, the first place to go is to talk about, do we have a good fit with the auditor that we're using on this job? It looks like there's a question for Tim here. It says, does NQA operate a local office in Nigeria?
The short answer to that is no, there is no local office in Nigeria. So that would be sourced out of kind of a regional office, either in the EMEA region, or we do have an office in South Africa.
Okay. Whoa, what was that? Okay. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the things that the DESARA group offers. We do internal auditor training for ISO 9001, TL 9000, and ISO 27001, and I show some pricing there. It pays to have an on-site, to have an instructor-led training for your company privately if you have 4 or more people. Otherwise, by the time you take into travel expenses and so forth, it's probably if you have fewer than 4, you might as well go to a public offering. But we do all of our training privately or virtual instructor-led. All our public training is virtual instructor-led. We also do, as I said, the 5 and 8 day launch cycle, the 5 and 8 day launch workshops, which can get you set up with a plan that you can go with and run with. We've had clients just go through that 8-day workshop and then run it on their own and call us back in when it's time to check them up on their internal audit. And you can outsource your audits fully or partially to the DESARA group. There's another question that says, How does the 27001 standard compare to NIST 800-171, which is a whole other webinar? But Tim, if you want to give a quick one on that, I know we're out of time, but those who want to stay on the line for that are welcome to. Other than that, we'll call this the conclusion of the webinar, but we'll stay on and answer this question and any more that come in.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess the main difference is the NIST 800-171 is a set of controls. So it's most akin to the Annex A controls that Karen and I went through in the control families 5 through 18. There is a lot of overlap in those controls. The sheer volume of controls in 800-171 is similar. I think there's 110 controls there versus 114. So a lot of overlap, but it's focused solely on the controls. It would not have any of the management system aspects to it.
Okay, that appears to be all the questions. I would just say, if you're getting started, the next step is to study ISO 27001. Of course, DESARA and NQA have webinars and articles. We have training. Then study it on your own. Get a copy of 27001 and 27002, and then look at it if any of the other guidance documents apply to you. And then let's see, do the self-assessment and objective setting. Why do you want to control information security and from what threats? Get your management committed, and then go through the planning, implementation, and certification cycle with ongoing improvement. We can do the basic training to get your management on board. Do they know what they're getting into? We can do the launch workshop, consulting remotely as well as on site for implementation, and then you may choose to go with your CB or with DESARA for your internal audits and your pre-certification assessment. But you've got to go with an accredited certification body such as NQA for the certification body itself. So here's our contact information. Tim and I are happy to talk to folks at any time, and we thank you for showing up today. You'll be getting a little survey that will allow you to put your information in if you'd really like us to give you a call. But also, if you just answer that survey, that would help us. That would also help us understand where we should be directing our efforts. Let's see, it says, Karen, what about lead auditors training? Is it IRCA certified? Our lead auditor class is not yet IRCA certified. We will become exemplar global certified, which is the USA version of that, and that'll be later this year, and all our courses will fall under that. Any other questions? Well, with that then, Tim, I will thank you for being on this webinar, for presenting and partnering with DESARA, and thank you everyone for coming. We'll see you on a future webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.